name's Terry, as it says up here. I'm not a local. I did fly in for this and have had my tests and all that good stuff. Just to give you just a real quick background why they have me up here talking about digital risk, managing your data, et cetera. I have been at Imperva, which is a data security company. We're not going to talk about my company today, but I've been at Imperva for almost 20 years and have been doing data security and application security, which is front end to your data that entire time. I work today with mostly financial services, healthcare, and other regulated businesses around the world. And up until COVID, I spent about 400,000 miles or so a year traveling around the world. So throughout Europe, Africa, Middle East, and others. So we're going to talk a little bit about how organizations, and I see organizations solving some of the problems we're going to talk today. A lot of this is about the risks themselves. Toward the end, we'll get to managing some of that risk and what I've seen as a success in terms of minimizing the risk around critical data. I will say there's a panel that we're doing on privacy, which kind of coincides with this in about an hour as well. Make sure everybody's got the headphones on. All right, good. All right. I think one of the interesting things for data, and I don't spend a lot of time on this slide because everybody knows attacks are increasing, they're happening more, you're losing more data, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the important thing when we think about cloud, we think about big data. I kind of equate those two together because a lot of big data has moved to the cloud. It just makes it easier for you to scale is the series of failure points. And you'll hear me talk a lot about the misconfigurations that happen, but where we see breaches, where we see problems, almost always in the cloud start with a lack of expertise or at least a lack of configuration. Public open file servers and other sorts of fun things. Dangerous new access paths. APIs aren't really new, but microservices, containerization, serverless, all the different components you now get in the cloud, all connecting in because everybody wants access to various aspects of your big data platforms, all present opportunities for landscape exfiltration of data, meaning if you have it, if you bring up a new serverless component, if you bring up a new API, you need to now protect that API. You need a solution that's going to be able to do that. If it's new, there's a likelihood that vendors haven't caught up with the technology that they're using. That's the criticality here, is technology tends to surpass the speed of which security can keep up in many cases and increase risk. Valuable targets, it's a pretty easy one here. Data is the target. Most people today, most bad actors today, don't really want to just take down your system just for fun, just to do it. Those people exist, but it's actually a bit costly to try and attack somebody, especially a larger organization, and try and take that organization down. The reason they're doing it typically is because there's something you have that they want. And the only thing you have that they want that they can pull over the internet is ultimately data. And that's really what they're after. Of course, it's a valuable target. It's why you see more and more regulations. Rapid adoption of new tech, I've already mentioned that, right? Your business is growing faster than typically your security department and even your vendors in some cases can keep up. And of course, easier stealth in the noise. The more technologies that you have, the more likely you are to have various different kinds of information coming in, which isn't a bad thing, as long as you have context to be able to make sense out of all of it and bring it together. When I started in this, and even before I started, back in the 1990s, 2000s, et cetera, this is what the architecture looked like. It was nice and simple when you think about data. And I'm just using databases here, but file servers and others. You had an application that used that data in some way. Even then, we had massive breaches back in the day. Today, the architecture looks significantly different, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a minute. But the point here is it was just really basic. And yet, even though it was basic, some of the challenges that existed on the data side were things like this. I now have to manage risk around my data, and my data isn't just Oracle or MS SQL or Sybase. It's DB2, it's DB2 on the mainframe, it's AS400. Shockingly, maybe not shockingly, but many of you may well still have mainframe in your organizations, particularly if you're financial services, you'll still have mainframe. You may still have AS400. I have a financial services customer that still has DB1, not DB2, DB1 in their environment, and it's got private data in it. So my point here is regardless of the architecture, regardless of whether you've gone to big data or not, all of this still completely applies when you're managing the risk around your data. And it just exacerbates the issue when you start to say, well, I want to take that data and also put it into big data platforms, data warehouses, what have you. Regulations, I'm not going to read all the regulations. These are all just privacy regulations around the world. There are now 107 individual privacy regulations around the world, and that's just privacy. That's not industry regulations like PCI and GLBA and JSOX and KSOX and Monetary Authority of Singapore and everybody else. These are all things that are saying, we recognize there are lots of breaches, therefore we're going to put governance on these breaches to make sure at least you have something that's going to bite you if you haven't done the right things. If there's any negligence, you've got something that's going to come back and try and drive the organizations to do something more. But I will tell you, not with privacy necessarily, but with industry regulations, take PCI. For years, organizations that had to be PCI compliant, they would say, look, all right, I'm going to be PCI compliant. That's the server I need to protect because it has credit cards in it. The other 1,000 servers I have don't have credit cards, therefore they're not on my scope for minimizing risk. I don't care. There's no issue that happens to me except maybe I get in the news for a little while, and while that's bad and we like to make pretend like that's bad, the reality is after a breach your stock might take a hit, but almost always it comes back. Because people are still going to use your service. This is too small to read. It's not supposed to be read, so don't try it. And these slides will be available, so don't worry about it. But the message here is that good data protection is hard work. The perception is that data security, minimizing risk around data, is complex, and it can be, especially the larger your organization, the more disparate your data sources are, or your data locations are. Yeah, it is difficult. But one of the things that make data protection difficult is most organizations don't really have a particular responsible person that says, this is all my job. There are DPOs, right? There's data protection officers, there are chief protection officers, there are chief data officers, there's security, and there's all the other organizations within the organization who will claim some form of responsibility around this. But the reality is, privacy might be owned by your DPO or CPO. Classification might kind of be their job, or maybe security's job. Alerts are probably your SOC or NOC. Integration's kind of everybody. Audit management falls kind of in between whoever's asking for the report. Threat analytics is security. So how do I make sure that all of this is really being done? And I have my opinion, and I have ways that people are doing this, and we'll get to that. But the point is yeah, it is a lot of work, and it can be complex. And so it's a challenge because there's so many different demands on your data that you really don't have this one place where you just go to and say, it's your job. And I'll tell you, I do CISO roundtables just for security people, but CISO roundtables, Chief Information Security roundtables, and one of the first questions I ask is, whose job is it? Whose job is it to protect your data? Take compliance off the table, take everything off, just whose job, when you have a data breach, whose phone rings? And half the CISO said it's my job. Almost routinely, half the CISO said it's my job. And so I looked at the other half of the CISO and say, well, then whose job is it? If it's not your job, whose job is it? And I'd get kind of a mixed diplomatic answer. It's everybody's job. Data security is everybody's job. Okay, but who's responsible for it? Well, how am I supposed to secure data when I don't know which data in each of the databases, file servers, is important to the organization? Only the business unit knows that. I get it, there are challenges associated with this. And that's the challenge when we start to think about risk on your data. It's not just threats, people attacking your system. A lot of the risk that exists in your own systems is the lack of responsibility and the responsibility of who's supposed to really be doing this. Where does the buck stop? And that can be a challenge. Now I doubled down on these small slides. It's the last small slide, I promise you. So I put them both together. But they both have a reason to be next to each other. The first one was just about direct access to your data. But that's not the majority of the access to your data. The majority of the access to your data actually comes from in systems that you inherently trust. You trust your applications. Correctly or incorrectly, most people trust their applications. They're our applications, they're my apps. Maybe I have some control out in front of them that prevents some of this bad behavior. But my apps are my apps. I wrote them. They're inside, or I bought my application. It's not like a DBA who's going to show up in the morning and maybe steal all of my data or download a database to take home and do something wonderful for the company and then lose the database or the laptop in their car and I have a data breach finding. What's interesting about application security attacks, and this is the second to the only time I talk about application security when it comes to data risk, what's interesting about them is application security attacks directly impact data. So I know you can't read the words, but maybe you can see that some of this is bold up here and the rest of it's kind of gray. Well, the gray stuff is stuff that, in my opinion, in my experience, doesn't really impact data very much. You can see over here, DDoS attacks. It impacts availability of data, but not a data risk, not risk to your data. But all of these black things over here, injection, and there's a bunch of injections over here, click jacking, form jacking, card skimming, all these sorts of things. All of these through your application are all direct risks on your data. And how you identify who these users are, right? When you think about a breach notification, one of the big fines that you see today with a lot of the regulations is you're not able to respond appropriately in incident response rapidly enough, whether it's 72 hours or some longer time depending on the regulation. What they're asking for is who did it? Who did it? If the answer is my app did it, well, that's not really the answer. That's just all you happen to know is your app did it because you're blind on the other side of the application to the user. Again, risk on this associates with what do you know from the entire path to when people have access to your systems to when that system has access to your data. And many organizations begin their data security program and their data security strategy in the back end behind the applications. I have others that begin it and end it at the front of the applications. They say, look, I'm not worried about my DBAs, I'm worried about my apps. It's probably a partially true scenario, but they begin out there and they never understand what happens on the inside, and we'll get there in a minute. This is PCI, or not PCI, this is GDPR. And I only put the numbers up here, not to say, wow, there's big numbers, but to say, if you consider even privacy when we think about data risk, the big bullet points up here are insufficient legal basis for data processing. You shouldn't have this data anyway. It shouldn't even be in your organization. That's 176 million euros. That's a lot. I can't help you with that, and your data security program is not going to help you with that. Your legal is going to do that. Non-compliance with general data processing principles is the winner, almost €1 billion. That's general compliance. A lot of this is manual work, paperwork, and understanding how your business units are interacting with your users. I highlight this one in red because this is the technical work. This is the technical work of saying, how do I minimize breach on my data? I mean, look at this, insufficient technical and organizational measures to ensure information security. I didn't fly on one particular airline today, not because they lost data, just because they weren't the cheapest one, but there's been an airline, of course, that had a GDPR finding. I did, in fact, stay at a Marriott today, and I still stay at Marriott. I will forever because I'm a titanium user, but still, they had a breach, and they probably lost my data, I don't know. But point here is they didn't have appropriate information security. And that was the problem here. Even though this is a privacy regulation, and like I said, I'm on a privacy panel in a little while, and we're going to talk, because there's a DPO in the panel as well, we're going to talk about subject rights, we're going to talk about data lineage, and we're going to talk about some of the things associated with privacy, but the reality is we're talking about 16 million euros for not being able to do a subject access right response, 9 million for information obligations, only $1 million for breach notification, but information security trumps them all. This is the fundamentals, it's the basics of how you're going to really be able to do things. Even your new privacy regulations say, look, yeah, there's other stuff you need to do, but you have to have the fundamentals. And this is where organizations tend to continue to fall down, is those fundamentals. So this is today. So today, almost most every organization is hybrid. Every organization doesn't look like this anymore. Now they're looking more and more like this. We're looking with APIs, microservices, serverless, Lambda functions, et cetera. Private cloud with your different databases, data lakes. I don't have files on here, but assume you have S3 buckets and Glacier and all the other fun things. And I'm picking on Amazon here, but it doesn't matter if you're AWS or Azure or Google. It doesn't make a difference. The fact is most organizations are in some way transforming or modernizing, whatever word you want to use, into this. And of course that creates risk. You're going to see one of my bottom three, back three bullets for what you need to do when you move to the cloud is don't trust your own people. Your people are good, I'm sure they are, but you need a second set of eyes on what you're doing out there because it's that critical. Microservices and APIs, as I said, are still here. And of course, sensitive data. Nowadays, people are even putting data into the cloud and saying, well, I don't even want to manage the infrastructure associated with it. I want managed data. I want to manage database. It's Amazon RDS, managed SQL, and others. That's okay. It's just you have to understand what the risks are associated with that data. In fact, there should be a little bit less risk because you're not using your own expertise, you're using people that literally do it every single day. I'm not proponing one way or the other. I'm just saying the less you can get away from people in your staff that may have a small team, a small security team, and move to somebody who does something every single day, Sometimes it's better, sometimes. Take, for example, DDoS. If your team handled all of your DDoS, that would be great. If you used a service, I'm not selling anything here, I'm just saying if you use a service for DDoS, people that protect DDoS, and that is literally their job every day, the implied comment there is that they're likely going to be a little bit better at it because they do it 10,000 times a day versus once in a year. Data architectures evolve. Data volume complexity is continuously growing. We know we're getting more data all the time, different types of data, et cetera. I think one important thing we think about risk is knowing where your data is not the same as knowing where your data is. It's designed to be that way. So knowing where your data is, saying, I know that is where I pick on PCI all the time, that's where my credit cards are, is not the same as answering the question, do you know where all of your credit cards are? You can't say it's in that server because that's where I put them. It's like my keys when I go home. I put them on the counter. That doesn't mean that's where they're going to be when I go looking for them, because my children, my wife, who knows, grabbed those things and stuck them somewhere else. So the fact that I have my server here and that's got my PCI cards on there does not mean I know where my data is. I know where my data is because I've looked everywhere else, and I routinely look everywhere else to see if I have that private data and if it's leaked anywhere else. Because routinely it does leak everywhere else. And I like to pick on marketing because I have a marketing department and I know they always want people's names, addresses, phone numbers, etc. And you have to fight that. I just had a roundtable yesterday with all financial services organizations. I didn't have it 6 months ago, because 6 months ago I wanted to reach out to all of our customers and say, hey, in Europe specifically, and say, hey, I'd love to invite you to this. But our legal department said, you can't just go grab their names, phone numbers, and stuff and go and do that. We're not going to let you do it. So we had to personally reach out to each and every one, and it took us time. And so I had a smaller group. It's okay, but that's the right thing to do, I think, in my opinion, if you want to be minimizing the risk versus me pulling that data into what would have been an Excel spreadsheet, taking that Excel spreadsheet and then using that to make all these phone calls and then sticking it on a file server somewhere to be forgotten for the rest of time, but now it's got private data on that file server. That happens. Programs fail when events become noise. We hear about alert overload, too much noise, too much stuff. And while that's a little bit about what this is about, the reality here is about what people do with your data, your logging data. Let's say that you're doing all the right things. You've got all your databases, you've got all your file servers, you're logging all access to all of those systems, you're putting it somewhere to do something with it. Many people, and you're going to hear the DPO from HSBC mention this as well, you can't just dump this data into a repository and forget about it and think that you've now got some mechanism to go and dig through that data. You have to really understand what's going on with this data. You have to have a mechanism to read through that data and understand it effectively. Take, for example, I have a lot of customers that use SIM, and perfectly fine to use SIM. We have a SIM, it's fine. I don't sell a SIM, we use a SIM. So we use SIM internally, but that's where I send my incidents, hence the acronym of SIM, Security Incident Event Management. It's not a place to dump your raw logs and hope one day that you're going to dig through that with some kind of analytics or reporting mechanism and find what you're really looking for. And that's what we find quite typically when there is breach notification requirements. Where did I dump my data? I stuck it over in this system, doesn't matter what it is. Now we need to go hunt through this system and make sense of this data that likely doesn't have any context attached to it as to whether this was a user on the web or a user here or a user there. You wind up with nothing. And there used to be a website called DB database, but it was a breach database of every public breach, particularly in North America, but I used it as a sample size. More than 80% of the breaches that happened said this is what was breached, and they were big round numbers, 4 million records, 8 million records, 50 million records, 100 million records. It wasn't 5,671, it wasn't 737, because they didn't know. They really didn't have the answer of what was taken. So you can imagine when we think about risk, this risk isn't just about the threat to your data, the risk is to the organization of what your data has. If your organization can say, I lost 515 records and I can prove it to you right here because here's the query that went to the database or here's the file that it was in, regulators will be, I won't say they will be lenient, I will just say they will be happier than if you come to them and say, I know we had a breach, I know it was that table, but I couldn't tell you whether it was 5 or 5 million records. So they're going to ask you, what are they going to ask? How many do you have? Right? How many records you got? I have 500 million records. Can you tell me it wasn't 500 million records? I cannot. Then you have an issue. So this is the problem that we wind up with. And the other issue here comes down to being able to answer that question, this disconnected piece, right? I'm not reading this over here, but the ability to really understand who that user is. People use shared credentials all the time. I've not been a DBA, but I work with a lot of DBAs, and I will promise you they're great people. They're great to go out with, they're great to have fun with, etc. But they share their credentials. We have a backup user, and we all use that one, and we have another user, and we all use that one. We log into these users to do the things we need to, because to try and assign those roles and rights to my individual user is just way too much work for me to really kind of do that across the entire organization. It's easier to have these bucket users that we'll use for specific functions. That's okay right up until you have a problem and you don't know who is using that user to do what. And you no longer have that reliability, accountability in it. So complexity brings fragmentation. This is the problem. This is really where it comes down to from a security perspective around data. Most organizations, as they've matured, have said, okay, now I've got data. Traditionally, I had data here, and I had a way to solve that. Whatever your way is to solve that. I have a application firewall or secure code review, whatever it is. I have databases in the back end, and I'm monitoring through turning on the logs and sending them to the SIM, as I said, or using a DAM, a database activity monitoring solution. Whatever way it is that you're doing that, you did that. And then all of a sudden you modernized over here and you went and talked to your vendors, and your vendors are like, I don't support APIs yet with my WAF. Or I don't support managed databases with my database controls. Or my identity access management solution doesn't support Google, it only supports AWS. Whatever the factor might be, you wind up with multiple individual solutions that are all based in through here, and you're expecting that your security team instantly becomes experts on that new technology. And they will over time. But what you'll find over time is you wind up with so many different technologies that have gaps in what they do that you wind up with your own gaps in your own visibility. And this adds to that complexity of the risk associated with this. The first recommendation that I would tell you, and it's going to seem complex, but the first recommendation that I will tell you is when you think about data risk mitigation, data security, if you will, the customers that are doing it the most effective, even though it's more complex, they monitor absolutely everything. They take the network security approach, the same thing they do for their network. There's not a packet that doesn't flow through a firewall in your network. Somewhere, ingress, egress, what have you, it's flowing through a network firewall, and that firewall is looking at it against controls, likely today against analytics and other things. Yet on the data side, that's not the way we do it. On the data side, that's not the way we do it. In this side, we say, well, look at all the data. Are you crazy? Everybody going in and out of my databases? That doesn't make any sense at all. Well, it does on the network side, but why not on the data side? My recommendation, first recommendation on the customers that I've worked with that have had the most success in recognizing bad behavior, identifying, and I hate the acronym APT because it's overused, but APT, identifying things that are happening in their network that are not just malware or not just somebody violating their login, but somebody doing something in the environment that they're not supposed to, logging into an old system to connect to another old system, all successfully and all authorized, to go to another system to do something that they don't normally do, means you needed to look at all three of those systems. If you're just looking at the one at the end, you don't have the context for the bad behavior that's really happening. And you can monitor all this data. It's not traditionally how organizations do it. And of course, this all comes down to multiple consoles and many alert sources. So I mentioned earlier, only reducing the risk at the application layer. It's not the wrong way. The word only is the wrong way, but reducing risk at the application layer is necessary. If you remember that chart with all the risks, the threats that happen at the application is not just here at the front end. That's the difference today. When I think big data, the first thing I think of is cloud, even though I realize there are big data not in the cloud. But the first thing I think of is cloud, and the first thing I think of when I think of application security is I think of edge. Most application security technologies are at the edge. There are others that are internal, but the point here is if you're just going to reduce the risk at the edge, you have to realize that you may be minimizing your ability to see what's happening internally. Cross communications, APIs talk to APIs all the time. Microservices and serverless all talk to each other all the time. Your application is not going to see that. However, it's great to be at the front because most data breach attempts happen at the front end. I think it was a White Hat. White Hat does application vulnerability scanning. White Hat had a statistic that came out that said 100% of the time on all breaches, SQL injection is attempted. It's only successful about 10%, 5 to 10% of the time. But 100% of the time, bad actors will try to breach your front end through what's called SQL injection, an injection which ultimately results in modifying or stealing data. So it's great to be at the front end, but the actual breaches themselves tend to happen on the inside. The largest breaches occur from the inside. Okay, so everybody's going to always try it on the outside, and if you have vulnerabilities on the outside, that's a problem, so you need to mitigate those. But your biggest breaches happen on the inside. Yes, there's a movie, Snowden, and in America, Bradley Manning, I forget what his name is now. The point is you've got different people that are constantly doing these sorts of things. Most of these you never identify yourself, and most of these aren't malicious. Most of these are just negligence. People doing something they weren't supposed to. People that are doing a drop database on what they thought was a development database and it was a production database. And it happens, boom, you're down. Luckily, I'm sure you have a backup and you can back it back up, but however long you're down depends on your business and the impact depends on your business. When you think about data risk and you think about what you're doing, as I already said, you've got to have broad coverage. You have to be able to support everything. And today, I'm sure if you walk around here, you're going to find somebody who says, we have a new way to store data, a new data storage mechanism, a new type of data structure that we would have in the back end. It's cloud native, it's brand new, you've got to use it, it's the fastest thing, and it's the best thing since sliced bread. That's cool, and when you start using that, it's going to be great for the organization, but does your vendor support it? Does your security support it? And who has the clout in the organization to say, you can't go by that. You're not going to use that until at least I can secure it. This is kind of the challenge that we have when all of your security rolls up, for example, to a CIO, and the CIO says, I need to enable my business and I need to secure my business. Well, which one comes first? The business needs to run the business, and they're telling me we can make X amount of dollars if we do this. Security is saying you can't do that right now because it introduces risk. Who wins? In a lot of organizations, we're finding that security is actually now starting to report now to the CFO rather than to a CIO. It's actually a recommendation in financial services in some cases. So the point here is looking at what those conflicts of interest might actually be and how that impacts your overall data risk. So I have 3 recommendations. I've already recommended a few things, but the 3 primary recommendations, and they are kind of big buckets, to be fair. Key considerations: getting visibility beyond the edge of data. Not the edge of data. And what I mean by that is, most organizations that think about data and how they try to achieve this, if their security team is driving it, will say, I'm going to do what I know, I'm going to do what I have. Identity access management, I didn't spell it out, but identity access management, IAM, is one of the first things they're going to do. I want to make sure that if that entity logging into that database or that file server, I want to make sure it's Terry. Definitely needs to be Terry. I want to make sure that it's anti-malware. I'm not saying these are the right things to do. I'm saying this is what you're already doing. Almost certainly you're already doing this. You're making sure I'm Terry, and you're making sure I don't have malware on my system. What I will tell you is most data breaches don't have malware, and most data breaches are authorized. So it's a fully authorized user accessing the data anyway. Most commonly, it's negligence, and as I already said, it's misconfiguration. And I'm going to skip down to this bottom one. Misconfiguration can be solved. You should trust your own people as you move to big data, as you move to the cloud. You should trust them, but you should go over their work with experts. Don't assume that the people that you just sent to training know everything in the world about how to do the right stuff. Bring in some experts. Use your consultants here, because these systems are critical to the organization, will cost you a fortune. It's better to just have experts. And by the way, my organization, we don't offer experts. That's not what I do. I'm saying go out there and find somebody. It's not me. Go out there and find somebody else that does this. Look for technologies that support your current and future use. It's not about saying we're moving to the cloud, so now I need to start data security in the cloud. It's about saying I've had data throughout my environment. I need to support both, and I need to have both. I need to be able to answer one question. What did Terry do in my environment? For privacy, what do I know about Terry? And it's not just in the cloud, I need to know about my whole organization. So whatever you do needs to support it all. And consider how fully your vendors support cloud native data stores and how rapidly they support new ones. We've kind of covered that a little bit already, but does your vendor keep up with current events? Do they keep up with everything? All right. I think I finished with, well, my watch might be fast, we'll see. I would love to open it for questions, but I think there's going to be other people coming in. But regardless, I think there's 10 minutes between either way. So I'll be up here to take questions if they shut me down or not, but I'll be here if you have questions. I'd love to take some if you have them. I'll put my headphones on if you have questions. I think you can. Otherwise, I'll stand up here and you can come up here.